Hello, Dan Alasso with History for Today. One of the applications that I've been using over the last couple of years to create content for my students has been an app called Pressbooks. I've written 6 ebooks using Pressbooks in the last 3 or 4 years, and parts of 3 others that are in progress. 2 of the ebooks, American Environmental History and a short handbook for writing essays in the humanities and social sciences, are both available in the Open Textbook Library. That means that they're available for free to students and to educators to read, remix, retain, revise, reuse, and redistribute. The last 5 of those are called the 5 R's of Open Educational Resources, or OER. I've been involved in this actually long enough that I sort of take it for granted, but I thought I ought to say something about this in this series on my work and my tools. First, though, I should probably say something about why I use apps like Pressbooks, and then I'll move on in another video very soon where I show the app and how I actually use it. So OER, Open Educational Resources, are, in my mind, a continuation of a disruptive and direct connection between producers and consumers that began for me with things like blogging in the 90s, and then maintaining my own websites, and then self-publishing a novel and a nonfiction biography before even getting my PhD. I've always been very suspicious of gatekeepers, although since I've become a professor, I suppose I've become a little bit less radical about rejecting any form of oversight or peer review. However, I suspect I do retain a bit of the attitude that I was projecting in projects that I've done in the past, like historypunk.com. In history teaching, this gatekeeper function can often be seen in what gets into textbooks and what doesn't. In addition to the shifting interpretations and priorities that historians study in historiography, there's a whole additional layer of what educators, and oftentimes what the institutions that hire them, want students to learn about the past and to not learn about the past. In 1980, Boston University professor Howard Zinn wrote what you might think of as the first anti-textbook, called A People's History of the United States. Zinn took aim at American exceptionalism and at the idea that the U.S. has always been the good guy in world history. Although most academic historians had already moved away from the consensus history of the previous generation and were portraying history as much more nuanced and complex in their academic writing for each other, it was the popular perception of America that Zinn was really taking aim at. The love it or leave it response that people had been making to protests over civil rights or the Vietnam War that had been a very big part of the public debate in the years leading up to the people's history. So although in the book he often argued against straw men and exaggerated, I think Zinn's history was very valuable and eye-opening for a lot of regular people, including myself, before I began studying history. In the mid-1990s, a sociologist named James W. Loewen also wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And Loewen opened the covers of 12 high school history textbooks and showed how, just as Zinn had suggested, they promoted a false and Eurocentric and whitewashed version of American history that not only absolves the United States from responsibility and makes it the hero in world history, but also ignores important social issues within America as well. This debate about textbook bias has continued to the present. A couple of years ago, the New York Times did a really good feature article comparing 8 textbooks from California and Texas, the 2 states most heavily involved in decreeing what content will be included and what content will be excluded from high school history today. The article includes a bunch of great graphics, side-by-side comparisons, and I often have my students read it to introduce the issue to them. Many of them are surprised and appalled by how different the stories of America taught to American students can be. Now, I read both the books that I mentioned, The People's History and Lies My Teacher Told Me, before I entered the History PhD program at UMass. And they both probably influenced my choice to become a history PhD student and influenced my interest in the histories of people and events that don't typically make it into the pages of these textbooks. that the authors had criticized. In grad school, I explored social history, which attempts to widen the historical perspective to include regular people in what used to be called the view from below, when most historical stories were told about great men and represented elite interests and concerns. This was the tradition that Zinn was actually a part of too, which is more evidence that the shift was already happening in academic circles by the time that he aired his criticisms to the public. Another subdiscipline that I was attracted to was environmental history, which had been born out of a union between social and cultural history with a focus on how the environment was more than just a passive backdrop to historical events, but actually influenced the choices that people made by helping to determine the range of options available. The focus, I thought, was becoming increasingly important as environmental changes were beginning to limit the range of options open to us today, and especially potentially open to us in the future. As I was discovering all this history, I was also influenced by my previous career, in which I had worked in high tech for nearly 2 decades. I was used to being the disruptor, making stuff that changed the way that people worked and disintermediating traditional business processes and supply chains and communication networks and the ways that people created and also got compensated for creating things and adding value. So you put these two influences together, and it's not that surprising that I began looking for ways to flatten institutional structures and to communicate more directly both with my students and also with the general public. Open educational resources, OERs, seemed like a key component in this, especially when I learned how much students are spending today on textbooks, which is an order of magnitude more than I had spent as an undergraduate. I'll say more in another video about the economic burden of the current textbook business model. In national surveys, which I duplicated with my own students, I learned that most of my students had chosen to limit the number of courses that they took in a semester to keep textbook costs affordable. And nearly all of my students reported that they had not bought a required textbook in at least one of their classes, even though they understood that their learning and their grades would suffer as a result. So these are some of the reasons that I turned to open educational resources and discovered Pressbooks. So in the next video, I will show you Pressbooks, the application that I began using to create my own textbooks and to make my course content available not only to my own students, but also to the rest of the world. I'm still using Pressbooks. I'm just finishing up a modern world history textbook that will go up in the open textbook library in the next couple of weeks. I'm also exploring other apps like Obsidian to deliver OER content this semester, but my mainstay is still Pressbooks. So stay tuned for a demo on the app and how I use it. But that's all for now. So thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned for more. I'll see you again next time.